right. Well, Happy New Year, everyone. And it wouldn't be a CHS webinar on healthy sexuality if we didn't have some technical difficulty. So here we are. Today's meditation on the first day of the week of 2017 is on emotional intimacy. And I think this is an appropriate topic as we enter into the new year, because when I think of emotional intimacy, I really think about intimacy with our own selves, first and foremost. And one of the things I'd like you to think about as we talk about this afternoon is what one word resonates for you as you go forward into this new year. I mean, I know that we often make resolutions or we set goals or intentions, which I think are actually more useful than the notion of resolving. I think when you set a goal or an intention, you have something to keep your attention on. But with emotional intimacy, if you just take a moment and think about what is the thing that most resonates internally for you emotionally, that would have you feeling like you were becoming more whole or more integrated. And for example, last year my word was peace. Peace for 2016, and I even incorporated that phrase into my password for my computer. So every day, every time I had to get on my computer, I was affirming peace in 2016. Now, of course, ironically, 2016 was one of the most destructive and painful years we've seen, at least in my lifetime, with the amount of death and terrorism and lack of peace on the planet. But nonetheless, the aspiration of peace had me spending more time in meditation and really having a vision for peace. And with that came a little bit more internal calmness for me. Now, it doesn't have to be about peace on earth. Your aspiration this year or desire might be for health or well-being or love, which is a universal form of intimacy. So you might be affirming love for yourself and for the planet, which I think is probably a good thought to have, love for the planet. So think about the one word that resonates the most for you as we go through this presentation this afternoon. So Elena Marie says that emotional intimacy is most meaningful and profoundly felt when we share our true selves with our partner and when we create a loving space for our partner to do the same. And this notion of sharing our true self with our partner sounds great. It sounds like a really good idea. But when we don't even know our own true self, it's very difficult to share it with someone else. And I believe that this knowing of oneself is extremely complex and fluid. It's not static. I can't tell you that today I know exactly who I am. I can tell you that today who I am is changing and it undulates and it depends on what's going on. And I think a good example of that is the holidays. You're going along and you're thinking you know who you are, and then the holidays are upon us. And then it's fraught with where do I go for Thanksgiving and who's going to be there and how do I feel about that? And then, of course, Christmas, Hanukkah rolls around, and then it's about being with family. And who am I in relation to these people today and now, and even to this holiday? How the emotional intimacy I have, at least, changes every year with Christmas, how I define it and how I spend time with it and the meaning it has for me. And it triggers all sorts of emotions because there's so much sentiment tied to it. So much of the past is tied to it. So often I find myself talking about what I did in my childhood, and therefore that's what I should be doing now, as opposed to letting that go and forming an intimacy with my partner and a new definition that can arise or emerge based on our shared intimacy of what we want this holiday to mean. And for many, many of us, this holiday has traveled far and is quite afield from the Judeo-Christian notion of the holiday, so much so that some of my Jewish friends get Christmas trees, and many of my secular Christian friends light candles as a symbol of, honoring all faith traditions. So this sort of fluidity occurs in our emotional intimacy with ourselves, with our partners, and certainly with our sexuality as we change and as time goes on. The word intimacy has often been defined or described as into me see, and I would imagine many of you have heard that before also, that little saying, and it makes the direct point that intimacy begins with knowing the intricacies of our own self. And as I said, those are the intricacies of our own self today, not tomorrow, not next year, but on this day in 2017, how much do I know about myself? And, if we are, or as we age, and certainly if you're on a call like this, you're on a path of self-awareness, that definition becomes clearer over time. And it seems to become a little bit less, shall I say, erratic, and a little bit more constant as time goes on also. And only by seeing yourself well can you then really see another. Because I think, and I believe Dan Siegel corroborates this, well, he talks about how the mind exists only in relation to an other. And so if you feel like you're losing your mind with a certain person, it's because that person is scrambling you or dysregulating your system to such a degree that you don't know who you are. And that speaks to a bad relationship, by the way. If you feel really crazy in a relationship, or like you're being abused, or you don't know your own self any longer, then that's a really good sign to get out. I saw the movie Fences over the holiday, which many of you might have seen also, and Viola Davis's character says in the end, when her husband dies, that he sucked up so much air in the room that she'd lost herself to him. She only had fragments and bits and pieces left. And that is sort of a whole other story based in culture and a particular time and place. But it also speaks to what happens when we lose ourselves to someone else. Then we can't really see into ourselves, and we don't know ourselves anymore. And oftentimes when people get divorced, that's one of the things they say, is that I lost myself, or I gave myself up, or I didn't know myself. I believe that we lose ourselves even when we're single and we're not paying attention. So this act of knowing myself is an ongoing process of being on a path of self-awareness, of self-examination, and also looking at ourselves in our current context, because who you were as a child and the context in which you grew up in is very different than who you are as an adult and the context you're living in today. And the context we put ourselves in also shapes who we are. So emotional intimacy depends or demands taking a very big risk. It means that you're willing to traverse the corners of your own personal reality. That's an earnest commitment to recognize and track your bodily-based feelings, to be in a psychotherapeutic process, because a lot of people will tell you that they're not interested in that. They don't want to know the inner recesses of their psyche. They don't want to know themselves that well. They're satisfied just to go through life in what I would consider a more superficial way, because that's my bias. But I really think that in order for an awakening to take place, a planetary awakening, what's demanded of us today is that we really dig deeply and straighten out these dysfunctional patterns. So, I see a bunch of people have texted their words or typed their words, and that's so sweet. So we have hope, reflection, nurturing, balance, and empathy, and honesty. So these are all beautiful words, and they're beautiful aspirations. And I would really encourage you to encode them into your passwords. Obviously, don't just use that word because we'll all know your word, but, add numbers and symbols to them. But what happens is that you are affirming them every single day because you're on your passwords every day. And that's a clever way to just embed them in your life. So Peter writes, my emotional intimacy relates to how I relate to others, important people in my childhood and present. I spent so much time trying to get my mother's attention that I lost myself around her. And I think that's true for many, many of us. When you grow up in a relationship or a family where your parents are less than sensitive or, can be even downright abusive, you will lose. In fact, you'll never develop a sense of your own self. And this self comes by way of neural integration and autonomic nervous system regularity. So in other words, if you're scared or terrified or you feel neglected or alone, that is, the whole body collapses or the whole body is on fire in anticipation of danger. And so a sense of self doesn't get to adequately form. The sense of self is always on high alert and afraid and nervous and anxious, or the sense of self is collapsed and depressed. And so it's not fully complexly connected in the way that it's supposed to be. And sometimes I talk about a car engine. There are many ways to drive a car. You can also hotwire a car, and the car will drive. But a car that is designed to drive in an optimal way, where all systems are go, is going to be a smoother, more integrated machine than one that's kind of, rigged and sort of funky and doesn't really operate the way it's meant to. It'll be jerky, it'll be discombobulated. And so you want to be as integrated as possible so that you are fully operational. And it's with that complexity of being fully operational that creativity starts to come into play, that these words that you've typed in, joy, security, progress, courage, become tangible and real. They're not just nebulous ideas. I mean, the fact that you all can name these things means that you have vision, you have complexity, you have capacity to see where you want to head, and that's an excellent sign. Sometimes people can't even come up with these words because they feel hopeless. So keep in mind that we really want to be tracking what's happening in our bodies. These bodily-based cues will tell you how you really feel and who you really are. And there aren't very many words for that. Things like sad or angry or joy or excited. That is the truth of who you are in that moment, not some conceptual idea of who you think you should be. So somebody writes, do you think getting better at communicating our needs to others without anger or fear is an effective way to get better at emotional intimacy? Any good strategies for that? And I would say yes, because when you can communicate to another, and by the way, it doesn't have to be without fear. It's very much okay for me to say to you right now, I'm really scared to tell you this because I'm afraid of what you're going to think of me. I'm afraid you're going to see me as less than functional, or you think there's something wrong with me. But I get super scared every time I see you do X because of my past experience. So any of you that are Downton Abbey fans, you'll recall that the lead character lost her husband in a car accident, and then many, many years later, she fell in love with a man who was a race car driver. And the first time she saw him race, she fell apart because she was terrified that he was going to be killed. And so this was a post-traumatic stress reaction. It was a perfectly normal reaction. And she was in a bind because she didn't want him to have to give up racing, but she also knew she couldn't live with the prospect of death looming over her at all times. And so this was a difficult bind, but one that she had to talk about so that he could make a decision about whether he was going to race again, rather than her making it for him. So being vulnerable, being intimate, is about being rigorously honest with how difficult it is to face someone, or to say, I have so much shame about what I've said in the past, or I know our relationship has been really difficult and I'm afraid that this conversation is not going to go well either, but I want to give it another try because I matter to me, you matter to me, and even if we're ending this, I want to be able to do it in a way that has some sort of dignity for both of us, so we don't carry it around with us in this kind of ugly, unfinished way. So I hope that answers your question. I think the main strategy is really just being honest and feeling the anxiety, naming that you're anxious or that you're scared, and also making a request of the person you're talking to say, I want to be able to lay this out and talk to you without you interrupting me. Or I want you to be able to hear this and not judge me, or to keep your judgments to yourself until I finish, and then we can talk about your judgment, which is really how you're triggered. It's not about me being a bad person. It's about how it impacts you or triggers you. Repeatedly feeling unsafe in a family teaches a child to leave his or her body or to dissociate as a way to survive. And really what's happening are the higher cortical functions, the part of us that makes us uniquely human, dissociates or disconnects. It actually uncouples from the limbic or more primitive brain, which is the midbrain. That's why I'm pointing to the middle part of my brain, as opposed to these higher cortical prefrontal areas. So these areas stop talking to these deep areas internally, and then you get a sense of deadness, a sense of, that's probably the best word, a sense of sort of blah or collapse, or I really don't know my own self. And this is a very elegant process that's built into the human psychological system. It's a form of escape from sometimes literally going crazy. One scholar calls it a form of escape when there's no escape. So if you're a small child and you're growing up in a household where there's yelling or constant raging or alcoholism or brutality, the best way to manage that is to for these systems to uncouple. And it's not a conscious thought. No child thinks, oh, I'm going to dissociate now. The organism cannot take the amount of energy that's coming towards it because the energy feels dangerous. So it naturally uncouples as a way to survive. And that's why I say that it's elegant. It's really built into the system. So these are not just your psychological failings. These are neurobiological constructs. And that's why, things like therapy are really helpful in being able to feel the feelings you couldn't feel then because your system dissociated, and feel them in real time today. And it's that simple act of just feeling it in the presence of a caring other who says, you know what, it's okay, or it wasn't your fault, or of course this is what's happened, that has these systems start to recouple again so that you become more associated. And so the problem with checking out that thoroughly and that intensely is that it leaves us no ability to feel our feelings in our body. And that is sort of where you want to return to, is to be able to feel what you're feeling in your body and to recognize that that is the truth of who you are. So when somebody says, I have a gut feeling, or I feel tightness in my chest, that is the most explicit, truthful knowing you can possibly have. Because your brain, your left brain, your logical brain, will always work to talk you out of that feeling. Because we tell ourselves, well, maybe it's not that bad, or maybe she's not as crazy as she appears, or maybe he's not that brutal, because he's really a good guy. So that whole notion of falling in love with potential is not necessarily your job. It's not your job to get a fixer-upper and spend your life trying to repair that person. That's a job for a professional, or that's a job for self-help, or some kind of self-awareness program that person is willing to embark on, so they're taking responsibility for repairing and healing themselves. So Jim says, I'm youngest of 6 kids and just went through Survivors 1, which is a program at the Meadows. For people that don't know, it's a week-long trauma program, and feel my childhood very neglected. My siblings don't have the same recollection, but I'm totally different personality. Is that typical? Well, I would say yes, it is, because we know that pathological neglect can be far worse than actual abuse, and even benign neglect, which is what a lot of us suffered where, like I said, your parents were insensitive. They weren't mean or cruel. They just weren't present for whatever reasons they might have had. There are myriad of reasons that people aren't present with their children. But that kind of neglect can be profound because it will leave us having avoidance structures where we don't know how to reach out and get our needs met and say, I feel alone, or I feel sad, or I need help. Instead, what happens is the tendency is to revert to what we call a one-person system. And for some, it can mean living in fantasy all the time because that's where pretend friends begin. And as we get older, that can morph into pretend love relationships, love addiction, sex addiction, especially if masturbation to pornography comes into play. Like a whole world gets created between our ears that isn't in relation to another human being. And that sort of avoidance can be born of neglect, and then it makes it very difficult to be in a love relationship because we're not used to turning towards another human being to get our needs met. We're used to just doing it ourselves, and that's what we call auto-regulation as opposed to co-regulation, which is seeking another human being for validation, soothing, comfort, love, attention. These are the things that therapy give us, and therapy is meant to be really training wheels for having a love relationship, because a love relationship will heal these structures and functions in our brain and body faster than anything. But it's got to be a secure, good love relationship, not a traumatic one that's reenacting what we came out of. That just cements the patterns. So therapy becomes a proxy, in other words. If you get into therapy and you have a good therapist over time and these structures and functions change, you will choose somebody who's healthier, and then you can practice these things in a much deeper way with a real person. Not that therapists aren't real person, but in a real relationship, not a symbolic one. And so, yes, there is often a disconnect between what siblings see, which is always fascinating. Sometimes the sibling that is the most traumatized becomes very narcissistic and doesn't think there was anything that went wrong at all because they are replicating the patterns of the parents. Sometimes the oldest child takes the hit and the brunt of all the abuse. So the youngest one will say, gosh, it wasn't that bad for me. And the older siblings will be able to report to the younger siblings what they didn't see. Sometimes they'll say things like, yeah, you were abused all the time, or Dad was always taking it out on you. And you don't remember it because you dissociated, but you have somebody reporting the truth to you, which is very helpful. So Serena asks, I just want to make sure I'm the right person here. Is intimacy something between two people? Yes, of course it is. Is it something that is a trust with your own self about having feelings? Yes, it's about trusting your own self and your own feelings and then reporting them to another person. Is intimacy the relationship between the different parts of the person inside of the person? I don't have a clear sense of where or what intimacy is. Is it the feeling silently trusting someone in my belly? Well, it's actually all those things. It's between two people. It's within yourself. It's about trusting what you feel in your belly and in your heart, because we do have neuronal networks around our heart and our gut. Some scientists think about them as our second and third brain. So trust your gut, trust your body, and you'll notice that you get afraid when you move in close. And it's best to report that to the person you're moving in close with, and hopefully you're in good hands. You're with somebody who will nurture that and say, it's okay, I'm scared too, or I'm here and I'll listen and I won't judge you, or that's really triggering to me and I'm feeling very judgmental of you and I can't hear that right now. Whatever it is, even if you're met with resistance, you are at least in an intimate, honest dialogue. What is the best therapy for avoidance issues? Well, I would say, long-term therapy with a therapist that you trust, because therapy does not happen quickly. It's about human relatedness. And interestingly, therapy is like going to the gym. If you go to the gym once a week, you're going to get once a week results. If you go twice a week, it's exponential. If you go 3-4 times a week, it's going to move a lot faster. Most people don't go that often, but if you can make it at least once a week consistently, every week without fail, and you show up and you get into relationship with that therapist and you're honest with the therapist, what many people do is they go to therapy and they want to be the good client. And eventually, that fails because the therapist wants to be a good therapist, but we're inevitably late, or, we don't have headsets for our phones, so we goof up because we're human beings. But you're getting into a human relationship with somebody who's feeling with you, who's hearing your story, who's asking you questions and are curious about your lived experience, and they're paying attention to their own lived experience in relation to you and reporting that back to you. And it's through that we start to experience our avoidant structures, our fears, our love of our therapist, our disdain for our therapist, our anger at our therapist. All of these things play out because therapy is an intimate human relationship. So we've all had roommates. We had roommates in college that we ended up loving or hating. We've all had relationships like that. We have familial relationships like that. We have work relationships like that, where we go in and out of caring about somebody, being angry about somebody, and the idea is that you repair it. Avoidant people tend not to repair. They tend to avoid, drift away, leave, because it's too difficult to stay in the heat and repair. And again, even the repair sometimes means saying goodbye, but it changes who we are when we stay for the repair. So notice your tendency to drift if you're avoidant, and the challenge is to move in closer and keep your own feet to the fire. Okay, so I think I found all the, there are more questions here. Okay. What is the best type of avoidance, for avoidance issues aside from a healthy love relationship? Well, I think I said that, therapy, and that's also why the 12-step program works so extraordinarily. It's because of the fellowship. It's because of the friendships, the relationships that get formed, the phone calls, the coffee, the meetings, all of that. It's about being in relationship with other human beings and getting your needs met from other human beings that you previously thought couldn't happen. It's hard to trust your trust, right? Well, it can be, but that's why I would direct you to your body. What is your body telling you in relation to that person? It's just like if you have a sense that something's not right, you need to trust that sense because you could be in danger if you don't. Whether you're in a parking garage or you're walking down the street at night, if the hair stands up on the back of your neck, you need to take measures to get yourself safe. That is a sense in the body that is accurate. So learning to trust what's true for you is about tuning inside, and mindfulness will help you with this. There are a lot of practices for learning to trust, like being in relationship with other people. You start with friends and moving towards love relationships as well. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on surrogate partner therapy where a talk therapist and a hands-on therapist work together with the client? Well, my thoughts are that you have to make sure that you are finding a legitimate surrogate partner therapist through a legitimate sex therapist. And when those two people have experience working with each other and they're both highly skilled and trained, then I think you can have a good experience if you are that avoidant and you're really afraid of, close in touch and being sexual with someone. So I would advise you to make sure you have trusted professionals leading you in that direction, because a lot of times if you Google surrogate partner therapy, you'll find people that are really more in the sex sex trade or, professional sex workers. They're not really sexologists and trained as sex therapy partners. So we have a call here from the phone. How can my husband and I reconnect after 2 to 3 years of essentially no sex due to his penile dysfunction and my anxiety, drug-related low libido? We're both 69 years old and have been married for 7.5 years. Well, my answer to that is you have to start slowly. And you have to start just simply by sitting down opposite each other, making eye contact with each other, and noticing what it feels like just to gaze into each other's eyes. A simple exercise you can do is to put two chairs facing each other so that you're knee to knee, and then notice how close that feels, if it feels too close, if it feels unsafe, and then adjust the chairs accordingly. So if you need to move back a foot, you move back a foot until that feels like a safe space. And see if you can softly gaze into one another's eyes and notice what you're feeling and what you see. You may laugh, you may be nervous, you might be uncomfortable. You may have judgments that this is stupid. You may start to cry. So whatever comes up, just let yourself stay with each other so you can begin to connect. Really, a sex therapist can help you with this, as can some really good tantric teachers. There's a woman named Dawn Cartwright here in Santa Monica who Center for Healthy Sex works with closely, who helps couples who have not had sex for a very long time. Wendy Maltz, who is a well-known sex therapist, has a book on people restoring sexuality after sexual abuse. And she's got some very basic exercises in there that help people start to reestablish trust and contact with each other that can be useful in situations for people like yourself who haven't had sex for a long time. But sometimes just holding each other, gazing, being present, deeply present with each other so you can drop all of the resentments in the story about what's happened. It sounds like there's a lot of grief and loss for the two of you because there's loss of bodily functions and finding other ways to be sexual with each other. You know, the skin is the biggest organ in the body, and there's an amazing amount of pleasure that gets derived from just being touched. So start there and see what happens, and then seek, the help of a professional. All right, so we're talking about reassociation here in large part when people are saying, what do I do now? How do I move forward? And this demands, as I've been saying, a reconnection with the body, a recognition that you have impulses in your body every second of every day. And are you paying attention to them? Do you think you're hungry because you just saw, some more peppermint bark on the dining room table? Or are you really hungry? So you want to be committed to dive into your body and feel today what you couldn't feel yesterday because it was too dangerous. So even as I'm talking to you right now and you're hearing what I'm saying, what are you noticing in your body? Are you falling asleep? Is this boring? Are you getting excited? Do you feel expansion in your chest? Does this feel inspiring to you? Or does it feel like a bunch of, nonsense and you're getting agitated and you just want to hang up the phone? What's going on when you check in with your body right now? And notice what you're feeling, even if you're feeling nothing. Sometimes people will say, well, I'm feeling vacant, or I'm feeling numb, or I'm feeling just a nothingness in my body. And if that's the case, locate where the numbness or the emptiness is. Let yourself dive into that feeling of nothingness and see what's there. Is it nothing like a poofy cloud, or is it like a dark cave? What are the parameters of the nothingness? What is the size and shape and feel of it? And just keep diving into that because that will inform you. Also locating, if it's in the center of your being, is it in your solar plexus? Is it in your legs? Where is that nothingness? And what exactly are the features of it? So don't try and fix it. Don't try to make it go away. Just be deeply curious about how these systems are resonating in your body. And if you find that, wow, look at that, some part of me has disappeared, or it's been sequestered, or it's hiding, but I know that it's hiding behind this little curtain, and it's starting to peek out. I just want to be curious about it. I don't want to judge it. I don't want to be angry about it. An example is, so here in LA today, it's a very cloudy day. And so I can get angry that the sun's not out, or I can get annoyed that it's not raining, but that's not really going to do anything, is it? Or I can just notice that, wow, it's cloudy and it looks gray and bleak and it feels like a winter day. And it even looks like it could snow, but it's never going to snow here in Southern California, at least in LA. But I can have the imagination that it might snow. And so with that, I'm actually present to what's happening. I'm looking at the naked trees and the leaves on the ground and what's going on outside my window without judgment, without wishing it would be a different day, but being in deep gratitude and very curious about what is. So Peter's saying, I feel identification of myself through your words is like coming home. And yes, that's what I'm talking about. Intimacy is a coming home to oneself, is stopping the comparison, which, our media and popular culture just drives comparison, because that's what a consumer culture does, is that if you compare yourself, then you see what you don't have and you are dissatisfied and you'll go buy things to try and make yourself that. But it doesn't really work that way. So when you can dive deeply into yourself through meditation, through mindfulness, through your therapeutic practices, through prayer, through fellowship, then you start to locate these missing pieces, which you can't buy at Gucci or at REI or whatever your preferences are. They must be put back together. You have to weave these pieces back together yourself. And with that, there is a coming home. Is EMDR a successful tool in reconnecting the parts of the brain that disconnect? Well, somewhat. I mean, that is a way to define it. And EMDR is what we call one of the energy therapies, and it can be very useful for trauma for people. And if you work with somebody who's highly skilled, then it can even be fantastic for profound states of dissociation. So that is a form of therapy, but be careful about looking for a magic bullet. There really aren't any. All therapeutic processes take time. But if you find a good EMDR practitioner and you like the therapist first and foremost, and they're skilled at what they do, then absolutely that protocol will help you with whatever's going on with you. So somebody asks, are there suggestions for people who may be on the autistic spectrum as their sense of physical sensation and identification of feelings is different? It's much more difficult for people who are autistic because these are structures in the brain that cannot be repaired necessarily. So it's like having brown eyes. You're always going to have brown eyes, and you're not really going to be able to shift that. So you have to work with what you have. So with people who are more on the autistic spectrum, they're actually going to have to name their feelings more cognitively. And I'm talking about a much more complex, intricate, deeper way of knowing ourselves, which is tracking feelings in the body that those who are on the spectrum can't always do. So it depends on how autistic the person is. So using feelings charts, which if you Google feelings, you'll find them online, I'm sure. And there are a lot of little faces with descriptors underneath them, and the person can start to name the feeling by seeing it cognitively. Then maybe they can start to associate that in a different way to their body. But it will be a much slower process for someone like that. So Serena says that coming home to oneself seems like a great definition, and I think so too. Thich Nhat Hanh says, I have arrived, I am home. And that is lines up with sayings like there's no place like home. And home is where the heart is. There are many, many sayings about intimacy and where to really locate it. So I think I answered the question about EMDR. So I think those are all the questions at the moment. So the process of repair demands this reassociation with the body and a commitment to dive into the feelings today that we couldn't feel yesterday because it was too dangerous. So sometimes it can feel dangerous in the moment too. there's a fear, there's a sensation that starts to arise in the organism, in the body, that feels like, oh my gosh, there are all these feelings coming. And that's why it's really helpful to have a trusted other, a fair witness, a therapist who can regulate those feelings while you're going through them, because you don't want to re-traumatize yourself by bashing through these defenses. They were there for good reason, so remember that. But as you start to tremble or shake or cry, if there's somebody there who's just compassionate and says, I get it, who says, oh gosh, it makes sense that you went through that, that's very regulating to the nervous system. So again, it's not just your psychology, it's your body. The organism is vibrating. And with a soothing other, through their tone of voice, through their care, that starts to heal. If you start to have perceptual disturbances like ringing in the ear, dry mouth, then that means it's way too much for your system to deal with at the moment and you're moving too fast, but there's definitely something there. So just accept that there's something there. Be satisfied with that and say, wow, I'm a little bit closer today than I've ever been. And I'm afraid, I'm terrified of what I'm going to find there because I don't want to know what I don't know. But my body sure knows. But I intellectually, if I have to know this about myself or the neighbor or my parent, then I'm going to have to grieve the loss of that relationship. And also my reality crumbles. What I thought was an idyllic childhood perhaps actually really wasn't. And then who am I now? So this breaking down is essential for breakthrough and a reordering to a higher level of complexity. Otherwise, we're just kind of bouncing off of our issues and our old patterns and reenacting them with ourselves and people we get in relationship with over and over again. So this thought of exercising intimacy is a metaphor of exercising every day. So connecting to your bodily-based feelings really allows you to see inside. It's really the compass for how do I feel right now? What am I noticing in my body? What do I really want and need at the moment? And see if you can dive into what you're feeling and become it. How does that affect you? So if someone says, how are you? And you just take a moment and notice that you're sad. And where do I feel the sadness? Oh, I feel it in my chest. And how does that affect me? Well, it makes me feel lost or lonely or like I'm insignificant in the world. And if your partner especially asks you how you feel, you say, gosh, I'm really sad and I feel so insignificant in this world, which is so big and so crazy right now. Then you will have other images or bodily-based feelings that come up. And those feelings will speak if you let them speak, if you don't think about it too much. And what are those bodily-based feelings saying? In that moment, to my partner, I might say, you know what, I really need a hug. Can you just put your arms around me and tell me it's going to be okay? Or that I'm not in this alone, or that we're in this together, or that the world's not going to crumble around my feet this year. Because this is how I always felt as a child, and I need some reassurance. And so when you or your partner can give that to you, or you can give it to your partner, that is a deep level of connecting and intimacy. And that's why it's always aggravating to me when people use the word intimacy as a euphemism for sex. It's not sex at all. It's close-in vulnerability, a willingness to really see and be seen and to care for the other. Because when we care for each other, we are creating secure attachment and secure functioning between the two of us. And then we're healing each other, and then we're healing the planet. So Jim says, I love the Mirror of Intimacy book as it's helped my emotional intelligence greatly, and I can assure you that Tom and I are delighted to hear that. As I recover from codependent sex addiction, I've left my caustic marriage, and I have a year of sobriety. Well, congratulations to you on this first day of the year. And And I would like to know your general take on when you feel it is appropriate to start dating again and getting into a romantic relationship. Without a romantic relationship, how can I practice intimacy? Well, you can start with practicing by yourself. It sounds like you've been out of your marriage for, well, I don't know how long. You have a year of sobriety. So if you've been out of your marriage for a good 6 months or a year, and usually when marriages are bad, we've been out of them for a long time, even though we're still in them. But certainly getting out of them and breathing and reconfiguring who you are requires some time, because you want to bring the best of who you are to somebody else. You don't want to be a fixer-upper for that person, and you don't want to be so raw and tender that every single thing they say wounds you, and then you've got to process that, and then they have to deal with it, because that's part of the fixer-upper modality. What you really want to bring is your best, strongest self to another person, and that doesn't mean you're not vulnerable or tender. It's just that you're not fragile and raw, which are very different things. So I think dating is very different than being sexual. So it might be good for you to start just going on dates, like coffee dates with people, having a conversation, paying attention, making eye contact, noticing what you're feeling when you're talking. Is the person listening to you? Are you listening to them? Are you curious? Are you asking questions? I can't tell you how many females tell me they go on dates with males, and I'm sorry about this, who tell me that the guy sits there and he talks about himself the whole time and never asked one question about me. Now, why would anybody want to get in a relationship with that? That's extremely self-centered, narcissistic. So think about the give and take. Are you talking about yourself too much out of your own anxiety, or because you just so desperately want somebody to want you? Are you really curious about the other person? Because if you're not curious about them, how do you know if they're right for you or not? You know, it's like if you go to buy a pair of jeans, just because it's a pair of Levi's doesn't mean you don't try it on. See if the waist is right. Notice how you used to wear a smaller waist. Are they long enough? Are they too short? How come they're cut this way? How come the waist isn't high enough or too short or low enough? I mean, you examine the goods before you buy it. You don't just go grab a pair off the shelf and take them home, because generally, you know, they've changed and the body's changed in between the times you buy jeans. So you really have to go through a whole process of finding the right pair of jeans. So why would you treat finding a relationship any different? Look under the hood, kick the tires, and if you have a good feeling when you leave, or you find that person curious or interesting, or your values align, then you might want to have a second date with them. And so after a coffee date, you might want to go on a hike. Or go do something that's not sort of formally a date, you know, like the quintessential expensive meal out to a fancy restaurant where you get all dressed up and put on your best self. Do things where you really see that person's humanity, see how they interact with the things that you value in the world. You know, if you like children and animals, how does this person relate around children and animals? Do you have things in common, things of that nature? So there are a lot of terrific books on dating. So I would recommend that you read one or two of those also, so that you're clear about that, about what you're looking for in terms of a date. So I'm starting to lose its battery on my computer, so I'm going to plug it in real quickly. All right, so I hope that, and that's a way to practice intimacy, is through dating. So when you connect to these bodily-based feelings, it really allows you to see inside yourself. So when you're with a person, you're noticing internally, wow, am I excited by this person? Do I feel inspired? Do I want to get to know them better? Or like, oh my God, this is such a dud, and I'm so glad this is only coffee. I wouldn't be able to endure an entire meal with them because, you know, she showed up with her cat sitting on her shoulder, and it freaked me out, and I'm allergic to cats, or whatever weird thing might happen. That's the point of coffee dates, is you just don't have to endure something that you're not enjoying at all. So are there any other tools other than the breath that help you get through difficult feelings when we practice feeling our internal world? Well, not necessarily. it's not just breathing. It's this notion of diving into the feeling and noticing where in the body you're feeling these feelings. So as I've said, when you have a gut feeling, or you feel tightness in your chest or butterflies in your stomach, you've all had that experience. You know what that feels like. I'm encouraging you to go deeper, to trust it more, to make that your best way of knowing. This is where intuition lives. It lives in the body. And all of these are your reality, which is different than what you think is going on. So connecting with another from this deep place is where your truth really resides. And that's the beginning of emotional intimacy, both with self and with other. It's recursive. There's a dyadic flow that's happening between the two. So it's intrapsychic, what's happening between your ears, and interpersonal, what's happening between the two of us, and also what's happening in my body. And these three components are essential for healthy sexuality as well. When you're having sex, all of those components have to be at play. So communicating your deepest feelings and risking being known, fears and all, will have you feeling closer and more in love with your partner than you can imagine. So even on a date, saying, you know what, this was really fun. I really enjoyed meeting you. I'd like to go out with you again. And that feels a little scary to say, or a little weird to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is the beginning of being vulnerable. And how does that person receive it? Do they shut down? Do they scoff at it? Do they shame you? Or do they open up likewise and say, yeah, this was really fun for me too, and I'd like to go out again? And when the body speaks the truth, that's when you're at your center. And it's from that center that you can love and be loved. So that ends the webinar today on emotional intimacy. I hope this has given you some food for thought as you go into this new year, and that you take the words that you've intended today and you embody them with all those you meet. So I wish you all great love, great peace and joy in this new year, prosperity and abundance. And I look forward to hearing you and seeing you in February when we'll meet again. Thank you.